on the sheet. Thank you, Your Honor. Well, Brian Wasson did not start using opioids at a party. At the time that he started taking opioids, he wasn't taking street drugs at all. He was a patrol officer who fell and broke his back while chasing a criminal over a fence. So he sacrificed his body in service to our community. And when his doctor said, "Take this for the pain so you can keep working," well, in 2002, that was the right thing to do. The medical records in the pre-sentence report show that the court can see how from that day forward, the local medical community kept the opioids coming for Brian. In 2007, the doctors prescribed enough for him to take 6 Vicodin per day, every day. And Brian would visit the doctor for totally unrelated issues, and he would dutifully list what his medications were, and no doctor ever said, "Hey, while you're here, let's take a look at your pain control." Now in 2024, there would be multiple eyes on a running script for opioid medication for 180 Vicodins per month. But Brian was long since hooked under the old prescribing standards that were described today in Dr. Stoll's testimony. And so his addiction progresses beyond what he can get legally. He's exhausted from hiding his addiction, but the stigma of admitting it is worse. And he starts diverting pills from prescription drug take-backs. And from that, his addiction just intensifies. As Dr. Stoll explained, it's never enough. And you're not trying to get high, you're just trying to keep dope sick away. In 2017, Brian tells his primary care doctor here that he is addicted and he needs help. And imagine how scary it must have been for a respected police captain to say, "I have a problem, please help me." And the doctor doesn't help. She tells him that either he has to go to inpatient treatment somewhere, she doesn't really give him any guidance on that, even though he might lose his job, or otherwise he's just going to have to figure it out. She doesn't even cut off his prescription for Norco or find a way to wean him off of it. Now by the same year, the end of that same year, 2017, Brian is wearing 8 fentanyl patches per day at once. That's what it took to keep him from these violent withdrawals. And he begins diverting from the evidence room. He couldn't see any way out. He becomes suicidal. He formulates a plan so that if he dies by suicide, his kids won't find him. As much stigma as there is for any addict, I have to assume it is even worse for someone who's dedicated his adult life to law enforcement and to working with people who use and abuse substances. And it's easy now for me to say, well, he should have just told everyone. But for Brian, as Dr. Stoll has shown us, it wasn't a reality for him. So by December of 22, he's moved from the regular fentanyl to street fentanyl. He's smoking it, he's smoking heroin. And finally, in April of 2023, he learns for the first time that our community has a medically assisted treatment program, which is what he was hoping for when he had talked to his primary care doctor in 2017. Incredibly, he didn't know about it, even though he was a captain in the police department, which raises a question, at least for me, of what does it say about resources for drug treatment in this community that Brian had to learn about the Suboxone program from his dealer. His drug dealer was the one to say, "I can see that you're in really bad shape. Did you know that there's a Suboxone program in town?" So his addiction nearly killed him, Your Honor, but the only crimes that he committed in his addiction were to feed that addiction. As Mr. Guinan noted, he didn't commit other crimes. He didn't commit assaults or terroristic threats. He didn't start dealing or getting new customers so he could make money or make a profit. He wasn't trying to thwart active cases. And in fact, the county attorney has not written in to confirm how many cases were actually missed or dismissed due to missing drugs. He diverted drugs and cash to feed his addiction. And he kept doing his job well enough that Chief Spencer regarded him as his successor whenever Chief was ready to step away from his post. It was in the full throes of that addiction that Brian Wasson ministered for months to a family that had just lost their husband and their father to suicide. He was cooking their meals, he was getting their furnace fixed on a cold night, he was checking in on each kid regularly. As much pain as Brian carried in his addiction, he still was serving others. And so that's the first point that I am making for this court, is that by granting probation, this court can show that it does matter when addiction is the reason for the crime. Not an excuse, but an explanation. And it does matter when the offender has committed himself to robust participation in recovery. My second reason for asking this court for a grant of probation is confession. We place a high value on confessions. They make our criminal justice system move more expeditiously. And when confessions happen, we discover things, we learn things we need to know, we learn details that we were unaware of. And that happens when an offender gives a voluntary, high-quality confession. At the time Brian confessed, he was not under investigation. The police have noted that in hindsight, it seems like he was asking a lot of questions about the evidence room clean-out. But at the time he confessed on September 5th, the police department had not determined at that point that the irregularities in the evidence room were necessarily the result of intentional conduct as opposed to not great management practices. For the clean out of that evidence room to reveal the path to Brian Wasson could have taken a couple weeks, a couple months, it could have taken more time than that, who knows. But on September 5th, Brian made his first confession to diverting drugs to his chief in my presence. And on September 29th, he gave a 2-hour interview to the State Patrol, and it was a voluntary, high-quality, suppression-proof confession. He confessed then that he had also diverted cash, and he provided extensive, credible, corroboratable detail about the flaws in the evidence management system that made his crimes possible. By his confession, Brian allowed for the creation of new checks and balances that had been missing and that are now in place. And so his confession made the evidence management system better. He even confessed to the diversion of hundreds and hundreds of pills from the prescription take-back events that were never logged or tracked in the first place. And so no one would have known that he diverted those pills if not for his confession. Brian gave the name of the dealer that he had bought from at the end of his drug use. And after he gave that name in his interview, that dealer threatened him that he'd better stop talking. Brian emptied his bucket in a way that very few offenders ever do. Now, what he could have done is, if he felt like the noose was closing in, he could have gone to his chief or the officers that were under his supervision and tried to pressure them into closing ranks and protecting him. He could have waited to be appointed chief of police in accordance with Chief Spencer's plans, and then maybe nobody ever would have known. He could have waited to see if anyone confronted him and then just said, "Prove it," and pled not guilty. But he, by that time, had done 4 months of work in a 12-step program to try to rehabilitate, and that work had impressed upon him that in order to stay sober, he had to be faithful to his program, and in order to be faithful to his program, as Brian said to me, "I've got to get honest." Now, he also could not bear the thought of being appointed as chief, promoted, and then humiliating his friend, Chief Spencer, if he confessed, or if he was caught, or if he died from an overdose. So Brian put the truth on the table, he confessed, and he cooperated, and he cooperated hard. By giving a voluntary, high-quality confession before anyone knew that a crime had been committed, Brian saved time and money and stress for the state of Nebraska. He saved time and money and stress for this court. No motions, no juror summonses, no suppression hearings, no competency hearings, no trouble. So if we value confession the way that we think we do, then Brian's sentence to probation, if the court will grant it, can incentivize other offenders to confess. And Your Honor can declare that the earlier an offender confesses and cooperates, they can earn leniency. If we send Brian to prison after a voluntary, high-quality confession, I worry that future offenders may take a message of, well, we have nothing to gain if we confess. We might as well just cover up. Who cares if it backs up the court system? We have nothing to gain. But this court can declare today that an offender can earn leniency and that the value of their confession will be reflected in the outcome in their sentence. This court can use this case as a model and say that when you ask for help, when you come forward, we're not going to say that there's no consequences, but we will honor your honesty, and you don't have to hide anymore. The last point I want to bring up, Your Honor, goes to the factor in Section 29-2260 of the offender's character. 4 months before he confessed, as I noted, Brian had thrown himself into treatment. As soon as he learned it was available, he was there at Cap 1 wanting to get in. He had one relapse 2 days after he started. He self-reported, and they adjusted how they administered the Suboxone to him. He has been clean ever since. Daily 12-step meetings, treatment groups multiple nights per week, individual counseling, daily urinalysis to show he's complying with the Suboxone program, work with his sponsor, work with a member of our clergy in the recovery community who helps him with the steps. And the step work is what led him to confess. Just last week, Brian earned his 1-year sobriety card. Now, he remains at risk of relapse. In prison, he will not have those 4 ingredients that Dr. Stoll said are critical to good outcomes. He won't have adequate care for his depression and anxiety. He won't have replacement activities. He won't have his network of support. And if he spends years in prison, likely in protective custody, if we're being realistic, his commitment to his program inevitably will suffer. Dr. Stoll finished his testimony by advising that the highest risk for opioid death is for addicts who leave prison and use at the level after they relapse that they had used before prison. Without that tolerance, their body can't take it. And so going to prison, Your Honor, would severely jeopardize Brian's sobriety. It could risk his life. Now, I've read the remarks of Chief Spencer and Captain Kite and Sergeant Enlow and Captain Brass. They feel betrayed, and they should. They worry about embarrassment brought on this department. I do not fault them for those very human feelings. They are hurt, and we know that hurt can come out as anger. The last time that Captain Kite and Chief Spencer saw Brian and me, on that day they were not in a place of anger. It was on the day of his confession, September 5th. And on that day, Chief Spencer and Captain Kite were in a place of compassion. Chief Spencer hugged Brian. He asked me and Riley if we would make sure he was going to be okay. And he told Brian, it's going to be all right. Captain Kite showed compassion and he showed kindness as he performed the very sad task of taking his friend's patrol vehicle and police gear. They showed humanity. So I'm asking this court to balance the understandable anger that Chief Spencer and his captains and his sergeant are feeling now with the feelings that were expressed by the 5 retired law enforcement officers who wrote letters expressing compassion, understanding, and support. Those retired officers have the same respect for the law as Chief Spencer and his captains. And maybe there's something about retirement that frees them to say what police know. That addiction happens to good and decent people. The retired officers have asked this court, as do I, to see that the goodness of Brian Wasson's person is much greater than his crimes, as bad as his crimes were. That he served his community with kindness and fairness and integrity. That his police work was pivotal to closing a horrific murder case. That the only reason that he ever committed any crime was because of an addiction that wasn't his fault, and that the Scottsbluff medical community utterly failed Brian when he asked for help. Now, the retired officers are disappointed in Brian, but they also express confidence in his ability to respond favorably to probation if this court grants him the grace to do so. And under Section 29-2260, the reasons are there to withhold imprisonment and to grant probation, to show that confession matters, that treatment matters, and that character matters. And so if someone asks this court, why did you give Brian Wasson probation? What about the abuse of the public trust? Here's some things the court can tell them. You can say that pleading guilty to 2 felonies and losing his career is hardly a free pass. The court can tell them that the court has the power to show that it matters when you confess before you are even suspected. You can say that the court has the power to recognize when 100% of an offender's crimes are born of his addiction. You can say that the court is authorized to help an offender maintain sobriety and continue treatment under the supervision of probation. The court can say that what Brian Wasson did here is what it, in terms of what he has done to mitigate this problem, is what it takes for an offender to earn probation instead of prison. And finally, this court can say that probation is for people who have tried to make right the wrongs they committed and who are one day at a time fighting for their lives. I would close by reading the words of one of the people that had written in support of Brian, who said that given everything that Brian has endured, physically, mentally, and emotionally, since that fateful night in 2002 when he broke his back, one thing has not changed: his compassion and his love toward others. He has always been there serving others, always been a friend to others, always been giving to others, even while hurting himself. And this person concluded by saying, Brian Wasson is one of the strongest, bravest men I know. I ask this court to exercise its discretion, to honor Brian's confession, his recovery, and his potential for redemption by granting him a sentence of probation. I thank the court for its courtesy in traveling out here from North Platte. I thank the state for its considerable courtesy since we first began working on this case in September. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chaloupka.